In the name of God, the most merciful, most compassionate, ladies and gentlemen, may the blessings of God be upon you all. We welcome you again to the second day of the Gulf Studies Forum organized by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. This is the seventh session of the forum, and today's session is on sovereign wealth funds and investment policies of the GCC states. We have three panelists today for this session. We will be speaking first on the GCC sovereign wealth funds experience in managing and maximizing benefits, then sustainability and challenges of investment policies. We will finish with the national visions of the Arab Gulf states. We have three panelists with us today from various entities. We start with Dr. Khalid Shams Abdulqader. The second speaker will be Dr. Nayef Alshammari from Kuwait University. Then we have Sara Bazoobandi will be our third speaker. We start with Dr. Khalid Shams. He is the assistant dean of the community college in Qatar, and he used to be associate dean of the College of Economics and Business Administration at Qatar University. He worked for the Amiri Diwan, the Qatar Central Bank, and the Rayan Bank. Dr. Khalid, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, first of all, we'd like to thank the Arab Center for organizing this event, which really tackles important themes for the GCC countries and the Arab world. My talking point today will focus on the experience of GCC sovereign wealth funds in managing and maximizing benefits. I tried to add some information as much as I could. I would really attempt to put everything I've got and squeeze it into the 15 minutes I'm given. I thank all the attendees with us today. Sovereign wealth funds are very important to maximize the profits of and the wealth of any country, and it's a tool to diversify investment to gain a return, which can be in form of capital or other forms. The word sovereign here means the state or the country is the owner of this wealth and this fund and has control over it and can exercise this control in any form or shape. When we say the state owns that, there are many assets there. There is, of course, the infrastructure and others. We do not mean that when we say sovereign wealth, although some are sources of income for the state, but are not considered part of the sovereign wealth. The sovereign wealth actually is gathered through making profit, and the government tries to achieve certain objectives out of the funds are not new. This is a not phenomena. It's said that they started or they were present in the 50s or the 60s. And the Kuwait is one of the first, if not the first, Gulf country who started an investment fund. Gulf countries started after 1973, after the boom in the oil prices, and they suddenly found an abundance of wealth, and the funds were established from that time onwards in many countries. There are different reasons behind that because the investment opportunities within these countries were rather narrow, and there were better investment opportunities with better returns outside the Gulf countries. And also, there was the question of stability also in the Gulf countries, which made the Gulf countries decide to start their own sovereign wealth fund. From 1973 until the present day, there is noticeable success. One can safely say that the Gulf countries have between 2.5 to 3 trillion dollars of funds. Of course, when I mention these figures, we really need some degree of accuracy to be established because the Gulf countries do not divulge information openly about these things. The total sovereign funds in the world is around 7 trillion, and the Gulf countries have 3 trillion, which is about one third of the total sovereign funds in the world belong to the Gulf countries. If we look at more detail, maybe the UAE has the most. They have $1.2 trillion, followed by Saudi Arabia at around 800 billion, then Kuwait around $500 billion. I think 800 billion for Saudi Arabia, for some 500 billion for Kuwait, Qatar around 300 billion, Bahrain and Oman together they have less than 30 billion dollars. These figures are absolute. I'm not gone into any details about them. If we calculate how much these countries own compared to the national GDP, we see Kuwait has four times its GDP, followed by the UAE, three times or double the GDP. Then comes Saudi Arabia about once, then Oman and Bahrain. What they have is represents one third. If we calculate from 1973 until the present day, we can safely say that we in the Gulf countries should have owned more than $3 trillion. It could have reached $5 trillion, but unfortunately, the Gulf countries have faced many formidable challenges in this period, which really impacted their ability to have the fund that they have today. We saw that the Gulf countries have gone through a lot of hardship difficulties, like the Iran-Iraq war, then the occupation of Kuwait in 1990, 91, 92, and then 2003, the war on Iraq. And we also, on the other side, saw fluctuations in the oil prices in 84, 93, 2003, 2015. All of this have impacted negatively the ability of Gulf countries to compound the sovereign wealth that they desire. So theoretically speaking, we should have accumulated more than 5 trillion. The other factor here is the expenditure inside the countries has seen a lot of increases. The Saudi Arabia has spent a lot on its local economy. Maybe the UAE is the least because it has not spent internally that much in comparison, so it has accumulated the kind of sovereign wealth. But the oil prices and the wealth generated from the oil industry has contributed to these funds. The state of Qatar managed to establish a sizable sovereign fund, and what has helped Qatar is the wealth generated by natural gas in the last 10 to 20 years. We are talking about strategies here and the objectives also. So, what are the objectives behind the sovereign funds? We know in the GCC sovereign fund cases, they're aimed to help the Gulf countries when oil is depleted. And the strategic question here is, will these funds provide a strategic alternative to oil? When we look at these funds, even if they're large in size, we cannot assume that the funds will be an alternative, because we have to know how much profit they are generating. If the return and wealth generated and profit generated is high enough, then we can say yes. But it seems that there is a long way to go yet, and there are many formidable challenges because the budgets in the Gulf countries relied on oil. Some Arab countries have managed to improve their budgets through sovereign funds, but they have not solved the problem completely. And we see every now and then austerity measures are in place. So, have the sovereign funds replaced the alternatives, and they diversified the economies? Maybe the local economy is not diversified. Yes, the answer is yes. The funds have partially helped, and the part of this, the sound is disconnecting from Dr. Abdulqader's source. They started or managed to establish some entities which have help, but it was not the kind of help that can totally replace and makes the economy diversified and in a sustainable way, and so much so that it can no longer need to rely on oil revenues. For this reason, part of the strategic reasons behind these funds, for example, these funds in the Gulf area, they can cover all the national debt. In Kuwait, it can cover the national debt 21 times. In the UAE, 27 times. Qatar, 3 times. Saudi Arabia, 6 times. So therefore, in the ratings, credit ratings also for Gulf countries, sometimes this rating used to go down, but the Dr. Khalid, you have 5 minutes to finish off, please. Thank you for the reminder. Uh, some of the strategic objectives is how can we benefit from these funds so that these countries can. The sound is disconnecting. The problem is there is still some points of weakness here before we can transfer the know-how and the knowledge, that we can transfer this knowledge to our countries. For example, when it comes to administration, we have a weakness in the national cadres, and if we want to transfer the knowledge, for us, this is still a strategic objective which is still absent. We haven't achieved anything because our citizens lack this knowledge. Also, in the foreign or outside investment, when the foreign investment comes to us, we will save the money that we have and invest it abroad. The more we have foreign investment in outside our countries, the more monies we have freed from our need to be spent inside, and we can invest them abroad. Also, there is another strategic objective, and that is related to the fund itself. I said at the beginning that if the sovereign funds profits are independent from the revenue generated by the oil industry, then we'll be in a good position. If we manage to use the revenue generated by the welfare funds and invest them independently from the oil revenues, then this is a good position to be. And also, so far as diversification is concerned, this is another strategic objective. We must diversify geographically. For example, some European countries and the United States in the Trump era, he used to follow such policies in trade which curtailed investment. China has suffered a great deal because of it. So we must treat this issue with caution. Maybe there are other issues that we do not have time to go through now, but they are included in the paper, and that is the sound management. I think most of our funds requires national management. They don't have. Most of them are run by proxy by people who are not from the country. They act as management. Also, supervision, transparency, and declaration of data information. The Gulf countries lack terribly in this regard, and consequently, even in the very structure of these funds, most of them sometimes are invested in private projects which are not listed, and therefore the secrecy is still there, and the transparency is lacking. These are some of the aspects that we have mentioned so that we can have independence in the wealth or the profits they generate, so that ultimately they can replace oil, and the returns by the sovereign funds can equal or surpass the oil revenues. There are many challenges to come. uh, do I have any more time, Dr. Hind, or have I finished completely?
أنت تجاوزت الوقت المسموح لك 3 دقائق، يعني عليك
You
تسأل
took
فقط
three.
دقيقة.
You took 3 minutes more, so we will discount 30% from your time. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a pleasure speaking before you. Thank you for your kind attention, and I'm ready if you have any questions.
شكرا دكتور خالد، أنا جدا
Thank you,
استمتعت
Dr.
في
Khalid. I
كلامك
personally enjoyed
وتحدثك
your
عن المنصات
intervention
الاستثمارية
and about
يعني
the sovereign
الاستراتيجية
funds and their importance in the
والاستثمار
national
في منطقة
economy.
الجولف،
But
وهي
what
دولة
I
تعد
enjoyed most
صديقة
is the
لاستراتيجية
role of
الجولف،
these funds
تعزيز بناء
in
الدولة
consolidating the
للخبرات
capacity building
العربية
nationally,
والأجنبية
and
والاستفادة منها
also how we can
والانطلاق
benefit
والتنصيب
from
من هذه الخبرات
direct
قد
foreign
تكون في
investments. And maybe part of
وهند
what you
سأتحدث له الأول
finished with
السؤال في حين
will be part of what
تدخلت
Dr. Nayef Al-Shammari
مستمرة
will be
في
talking
السياسات
about.
الخارجية.
He is our
حتى
next
أكون
speaker,
بجانب الشكر
and Dr. Naif
قسم
Al-Shammari,
الاقتصاد
who is an
بجامعة
associate
القاهرة.
professor in the economics
وأرحب
department at the
بضيوفكم
College of
الكرام
Business Administration,
القادمين
Kuwait
من المشارق
University.
في كل
Formerly,
مكان
he was
بجانب
assistant dean of the
الأستاذ
College. He has also been a visiting professor at the Paris School of International Affairs. He has many publications to his name. I just would like to remind our researchers who are with us today, they can use the raise hand feature if they have a question. As for the participants from outside, they can choose to pose their questions. Dr. Naif, please.
شكرا دكتور هند وشكرا دكتور خالد على البرزنتيشن. بداية
Thank
أنا
you,
جدا
Dr. Hend, and thank you, Dr. Khalid, for your presentation. I'm very glad to participate with you in this symposium, and I would like to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for this invitation. I hope that my intervention will be based on science, and I will do. I will share the screen now, if you allow me.
ما أدري إذا واضحة دكتورة. Good. عفوا. So I have to start from the beginning. Okay. في هذه الجلسة تحديدا اللي راح أقدمه هو
In this
ملخص.
intervention, I'll give you an outline about a study that deals with the sustainability of the investment policies of the GCC sovereign funds and the current challenges that the SWFs are encountering. It is a commonplace for everyone, as Dr. Khalid knows, the GCC countries has a peculiar position as far as oil production is concerned. Not only this, but it has sovereign funds that are funded by the revenues of oil in order for such revenues to be invested in different sectors. Yes, there are different policies in the Gulf countries. The size and the assets of the sovereign funds are different, but the goal is pretty much the same, i.e., the diversification of the economy of these countries. This objective will be far-fetched unless we plug the gaps in the economies themselves in the GCC countries. As you can see on the screen, we do notice that the sovereign funds investments do focus on three investment portfolios, the cash, the treasury bills, as well as the government bonds, or the other portfolios that relate to the public funds. And the third option is to do with the real estate sector. It is been noted that the investments do relate to the revenues that are modest to the tune of 8% of the real estate and 10% of the infrastructure. But the minimum investments do relate to the fixed portfolios whereby the revenues are lesser than the revenues of the other portfolios. And thus, we can say that the Gulf sovereign funds are diverse in their investments because usually the investments, as we said, relate to two portfolios, the fixed portfolio as well as the real estate and infrastructure portfolio. As far as the sustainability of the funds is concerned, the sustainability relates to the source of funding, i.e., the oil revenues in the GCC countries. And these oil revenues relate to the price fluctuation of the raw material. So, undoubtedly, the price of oil and the derivatives thereby might lead to the exposure of the revenues, and this would affect adversely the sustainability of the sovereign fund, especially when the oil prices are plummeting. As far as the oil revenues are concerned, and if we want to measure the exposure of the GCC countries in this regard, we note that the fluctuations of the oil revenues led to the fluctuation of the sources of the GDP itself, as you can see on the screen. And I talked about the standard deviation, and as you can see, the standard deviations, or most of them in the GCC countries, save Bahrain, except Bahrain, uh, uh, do present us with a picture that is above the median kind of uh, exposure levels in comparison to the other countries in the MENA region. And uh, this would affect inevitably the policies of the economic reform or the delay or postponement thereby of such policies. This also affects the investment related policies of the sovereign funds themselves. In the same vein, the diversification of the local economic activities away from the oil revenues and thus achieving economic stability is a prerequisite of the sustainability of the sovereign funds themselves. And Dr. Khalid has talked about the diversification of the sovereign funds. What's the objective of the sovereign funds? The main objective is the diversification of the economy, as we said. As we look at this chart that relates to the foreign direct investments or the FDIs, the net inflow uh, of the FDIs as an index of the diversification of the economies and the attraction of the FDIs, especially as far as the uh, currency exchange levels are concerned, they are indeed plummeting, or they had plummeted in the 80s and the 90s, and they were better in the current millennium. We move now to the outstanding challenges. Despite the fact that the sovereign funds in the GCC countries are different in size, but they are somewhat similar as well. We need to take into consideration that there are certain challenges that we encounter. And here I'll be touching upon such challenges one by one. If I summarize these challenges, there are five. The first one relates to the funding source. And this funding source might or definitely has been affected by the fluctuation of the prices of oil. And we have witnessed this in Kuwait since 1976 up to this moment. 10% of the oil revenues go to the sovereign fund. In 2013, 2014, the percentage jumped to 25. But this year, these cuts were zero, unfortunately. Not only this, the 10% of last year were kind of reclaimed by the deficit of the budget of this year. And that's why this is the first challenge that we encounter. The second one is to do with transparency and governance. The Dr. Khalid touched upon these two issues, and as you can see, the Limburg model uh, index considers that that's the minimum level of the transparency is to the tune of 8. And most of the GCC countries, the level of this index is lesser than 8. So it is unacceptable as far as the transparency is concerned. So again, when it comes to the standard of the legislations themselves, they are somewhat feeble. because this is a reflection of the legal framework of the GCC countries, and that's why we need to take into consideration the betterment of the transparency itself, especially the governance of the financial sector. In addition to that, this would lead to having a bulwark against any kind of abuse as far as the sovereign funds are concerned. The third challenge is to do with the degree of exposure on the governance or the management of the public budget. In Kuwait, there have been talks about emphasizing the liquidity in this regard. And as you can see, the index here, the more it is higher, the lesser it is feasible. And that's why we can see that this index since 2014, this index has been fluctuating because of the fluctuations of the prices of the oil since 2010. Sometimes it is secure, sometimes it is bad, especially in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The other challenge is to do with the economic and fiscal stability and the extent or the capacity of having the foreign currency in the GCC countries. In accordance with the liquidity index, as you can see, the as the index increases, the exposure increases. And in 2015, this index has been decreasing, and that's why there is a threat as far as the fiscal and economic stability is concerned, and this would affect adversely the sovereign funds in the future. The last challenge is to do with the local economic competent or competitiveness. As we talk about the competitiveness, we talk about the SMEs, we talk about emphasizing or polishing the skills of the workers and the cadres and so on and so forth. And as the GCC countries rankings in accordance with such index is concerned, we discover that Singapore, Norway, Korea, and Chile do have the upper hand in this regard in comparison with the GCC countries. And that's why the GCC countries need to have different assets away from the hydrocarbon assets in order to boost such index. In conclusion, the sustainability of the sovereign funds is linked directly to the diversification of the local economy and the sources of income. And this very fact is far-fetched unless we embark on urgent reforms in these countries. Thank you for taking much of your time, and thank you for your listening.
شكرا دكتور نايف. ما شاء الله أعطيتنا ملخص لأهم التحديات التي فعلا الصوت واضح تسمعون؟
Can you hear me?
شكرا دكتور نايف.
Thank you, Dr. Nayef, for this very adequate summary. Although they can vary by some degree or another from one country to another, but nonetheless they are all there and all present. Maybe the fluctuations of the oil prices remains as the most formidable amongst all these challenges. In continuation of our discussion, now we move to Sara Bazoobandi. She will be speaking about sovereign wealth funds and national visions of the Arab Gulf states. She is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council within the Geoeconomics Center and Global Energy Center, and also formerly she used to be an international political economy lecturer at the Regent's University in London, and she has worked in many other renowned places. مرحبا بكم جميعا. Please forgive me, my Arabic is not
سأواصل هذا البانel presentation بالإنجليزي.
continue in English.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings from Hamburg in Germany. Last year around this time in December was my time to travel to the region. I had great opportunities to meet many of you in person, enjoy the amazing weather in Doha, in other parts of the region, but sadly this year we're all separated by this virus. So let's hope that this is going to be the last year that we're going to suffer from this. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you for your introduction, and thank you for the excellent presentations provided by the colleagues. I think that provides a very good background and context to what I'm about to say on this topic, on the question of sovereign wealth funds and the role that they are likely to play in the future of the GCC economies. So allow me to start with a little bit of background, and that was partly covered by Dr. Khalid, that he mentioned a lot of these funds have been existing and operating for several decades, but that is absolutely true. The point that these funds have become very important to the global community, of course, they have been for several years the clients of several investment organizations in Europe and in Western world, who worked on behalf of these funds to invest their assets. But the point that they became very important, and the point that was very crucial was the financial crisis in 2008, and the reason was that a lot of these organizations were providing generous investments for the troubled financial institutions in the West. And that, of course, was as a result of several years of accumulation of assets. High oil prices allowed the GCC governments, to varying degrees, of course, not all the GCC governments have the same size of assets in the sovereign wealth funds, understandably due to the differences in dynamics of their economies and so on and so forth. But that the period, the few years running up to the 2008, starting perhaps from 2005, 2006, was the period that these organizations have the peak of, up to that point, the peak of their asset accumulations. And as a result of this fast and sizable accumulation of assets, a lot of these countries have started to divide their wealth into various investment vehicles. So in other words, there were always government investment organizations, government investment bodies that were acting as the main sovereign wealth funds of the GCC countries. And there were on the side, on the fringe of these main investment organizations, there were several other smaller organizations. There are examples, especially in the UAE, there are several examples, for example, in comparison, the comparison between Adia and Mubadala, or in Dubai as well. And so the years of the high oil prices, rapid asset accumulation are behind the GCC. That period was the period in which a lot of these governments were keen on acquiring trophy assets, making investments that are prestigious, investments that can capture global headlines, that can find themselves to the first pages of the Financial Times, and so on and so forth. But that dynamic and that environment has changed, and The reason for that is, of course, the changes in the trend in the global oil market. The average prices of oil went from $110 per barrel in 2013 to 44 in 2016. So in half a decade after 2008, where there was the peak of, if you like, the PR expansion of these organizations, all of the GCC economies were hit hardly by the decline in oil prices. Most of the GCCs experienced deficits as a result of this decline in oil prices. Oman 22%, Saudi Arabia 17%, Bahrain 14%. So to varying degrees, each and every one of these countries, different depending on the size of their economies, suffered from this decline in the oil market. And of course, now in 2020, we're facing the global pandemic. As a result of that, again, decline of energy prices. In June 2020, oil price average was about $40 per barrel, which is below the break even for most of the GCC economies, maybe only with the exception of Qatar. So it was time to revise the strategies, economic strategies for the GCC policymakers in many respects, specifically in terms of managing and strategizing their vision for development and investment of their sovereign wealth funds. Most of these economic strategies that are revised have been presented and are now known and publicly available through the government visions, which outline these new strategies, and they emphasize on diversification and sustainability, basically. And investment, they encourage investment in clean energy, they encourage investment in digital technology sector, and so on. Of course, in addition to all of this, there is reform in the private sector, the reform in the labor sector, and so on. Another sign of this revision, the perhaps forced revision for the economic strategies of the GCC, is the perception of the governments towards collecting taxes. Up until very recently, tax collection was not a part of revenue generating strategies of the GCC governments, and only recently Saudi Arabia and UAE were the front runners of introducing value-added tax, for example. Then it was followed by Bahrain about a year later, and introduction of perhaps revision of corporate tax is also another element of these revised strategies across the region. So going back to the impact of COVID, before I sort of wrap up my points, another important event which is even pushing the GCC strategy makers further to rapidly implement these reforms and these changes is the current global pandemic, because at the same time where the revenue is declining because of the decline of energy prices, the cost and the government expenditure are on the rise. In addition to the healthcare costs across the GCC, in total about 97 billion stimulus package by the governments have been introduced only in response to the current crisis. So this, the trend is, and the dynamics of the global economy have pushed the GCC strategy makers to change and revise the economic policies. What does it mean for sovereign wealth funds? The most important trend that we observe as a result of these strategies and these revisions on the sovereign wealth funds is the consolidation of these organizations. And consolidation of assets and investment funds is something that has recently been a trend not only among sovereign wealth funds at the global level, but also amongst pension funds. And the reason and the logic behind this desire for consolidating assets and investment vehicles is to achieve greater economies of scale, opportunity to increase their deal sizes, investment sizes, to gain access to better investment opportunities, and of course, more effective governance and internal resourcing. The question of transparency was discussed by Dr. Nayef in detail, and that is indeed one of the major developments that is likely to take place across the GCC sovereign wealth fund as a result of these consolidations. And there are several examples. For example, recently ADIC, IPC were consolidated into Mubadala in UAE. Of course, PIF in Saudi Arabia has consolidated several pots of government assets. In Oman as well, the Oman Investment Fund consolidation with the State General Reserve Fund and so on. At the pension fund level also, there are various examples in Denmark, in Netherlands, in Australia. Government pension funds have taken relatively similar initiatives to consolidate smaller pension funds into one umbrella in order to achieve the points that I earlier mentioned. Generally speaking, it is widely accepted that larger funds are able to achieve better governance model. They can place the several investment institutions under one umbrella in order to have a clearer mandate, to be more transparent, to be more autonomous, and to achieve better governance. So this is a trend that we are likely to see moving forwards as a result of the changes in the global economic system. There are, of course, several challenges and some positive aspects to this. One of the key challenges is for these sovereign wealth funds, specifically for the GCC ones, is that of course, as a result of the global pandemic, there are a lot of investment opportunities arising for investments of this nature and of this caliber with this size of assets. However, the tax landscape at the global level in 2020 is not similar as it was back in 2008. So in other words, a lot of investments that back in 2008 in the aftermath of the financial crisis was provided to the GCC sovereign wealth funds are going to be more problematic in the current environment. And the reason is that the major global initiatives such as Foreign Account Tax Compliance Acts, base erosion and profit shifting regulations, the EU coordinated approach towards the tax regulation are going to make investments for these funds more expensive and more complicated. It will require more expertise, whether it's in-house developed expertise or it's external advisory roles. But nevertheless, it is going to be more expensive and more complicated for these funds. There's also, of course, positive news to this trend, and that is in my opinion, one of the most positive aspects is that the awareness and the attitude towards global climate action across the region have changed quite significantly, and it is visible in the government visions, in the investment mandates of the sovereign wealth funds. For example, I read recently that Mubadala has voluntarily signed up for the One Planet Sovereign Wealth Fund initiative, which is a global initiative that is aiming to promote global climate change actions and responsible investments towards combating global climate change. And of course, last but not least, the desire and the passion, even I would say, for investments by these funds in a digital technology sector is going to have a significant impact on their local economies if it is done in a proactive and productive manner, by which I mean, of course, these funds are quite wealthy. They have a lot of assets under their control. Only in 2020, both Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth funds invested over $1 billion each in technology, in digital technology, in only two companies, Reliance and Geo Platforms. These are two Indian front-runner fiber optic infrastructure providers. If these investments are done productively, it will pave the ground for creating the platform for better and faster diversification of the GCC economies. Of course, there is a long way to achieve all of these diversification goals that are outlined by most of these visions, to turn the GCC economies into knowledge-based economies, into technology-based economies. In the current environment, it's going to be a longish term plan, but these are the type of moves and type of investments that are going to facilitate achievement of those goals. So I used about 13 minutes and 40 seconds. I will just stop myself here and I will open the floor for the question and answer. Thank you very much.
شكرا سارة. يمكن سارة تحدثت من نفس
Sara, I think Sara spoke in the same framework regarding the challenges faced by the GCC welfare funds, and she gave some examples of how they can be sustainable. Also, at the end, she referred to some of the challenges and possible solutions. Before we open the floor for discussion, first of all, please allow me to pose a question to our three panelists. I thought of this question while listening to you. It seems that the Gulf countries have realized the importance of these sovereign welfare funds and started developing them maybe early in the day compared to other regions. And this is what Sarah said and Dr. Khalid. Some countries have managed to achieve some temporary sustainable. Others started losing and face a depletion of this wealth. The continuous fluctuation in the oil prices, the rise in government expenditure, and also the crises, whether a political crisis or the COVID-19 health crisis. These countries who have invested well, if we can classify them as such, they managed to what extent they have protected their investment for the future generations. Please, I would like to hear your input on this. Please go ahead. Who wants to start first?
يعني تختارين الضيوف يمكن أحسن قبل المقيمين والمواطنين اللي في الدوحة. طيب احنا على حسب الترتيب نمشي. يعني احنا
Perhaps it would have been better for our guests to answer because we are locals. But thank you for giving me the floor. The sovereign funds are vital in the Gulf states. And indeed, they have salvaged us, especially during the crises, as well as the political crises. They resembled cushions, indeed, so that our economy can be somewhat sustainable. However, if I go back 10 years, then I would present you with different challenges. And as I said, my figures are not incast figures. They are not 100% accurate. They might be accurate from the credit rating agencies, but still, I think, as I said, these foreign funds were cushions that we utilized in order to stave off any crises in the past. As you know, fracking is afoot in the United States of America, and the oil resources will be depleted one day. So we need to diversify our economies. This is a must. And indeed, we need to invest all across the world, and we need to focus on such investments. And I think that the main gate to emphasize these investments is through these funds. We need perhaps to buy shares in multinational companies from time to time in order to boost our economies. We need to focus on such approach in order to utilize such sovereign funds. Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Dr. Nayef, allow me please to read one of the comments. Bilal Al-Habsi in the chat room, he has a number of observations. The data, the real data are unclear. As he said, there is an absence of governance, there is a lack of transparency, and the assets of the sovereign funds are subject to political projects. And from his own perspective, I think this would lead to the erosion of the confidence of the populace in the Gulf region. Do you think that the sovereign funds might resemble a guarantee for our future? There's another gentleman called Psisu that asks about justice. Comprehensive or inclusive justice depending on such investments. Yes, they're both interlinked. I think the two questions. Yes, I'll link this to the idea of the sustainability of the sovereign wealth funds. I always say that having an enterprise relates to the raison d'etre of the project itself. I think that we need to diversify our economies. Do we think that the sovereign funds will be the panacea or the magic pill that we might stomach? I don't think so. I think that the sovereign wealth funds always and directly relate to the prices of the oil because, as I said, there are cuts from the oil revenues that pour into these funds in the first place, and the percentage was 10% in Kuwait, as I said. The answer is to have economic reforms. The answer is to genuinely diversify our economies. But have we embarked on economic reforms? Have we embarked on political reforms? Because we need as well as economic reforms, political reforms. And I think this all relates to the social contract between the populace of the Gulf regions and the rulers. So, having into place economic reforms must lead perhaps to having a tax system. We ought to understand that we might pay in the future for our electricity bills, for our gas bills. I think we need to change this social contract between the peoples in the Gulf countries and the rulers. I think, yes, there is a political objective as far as the investments of the assets of the SWFs. Yes, this is true. But I think that we need to have more transparency as far as these sovereign wealth funds are concerned. Thank you, Dr. Naif. Changing the social contract, does that mean the lack of the rentier economy? We have Mr. Boufleh Nabil. Yes, please.
معكم الأستاذ نبيل بوفليح.
Nabil Boufleh is
السلام عليكم.
talking to you from Algeria.
السلام عليكم.
Very good day to you.
مداخلاتكم القيمة.
Thank you for your interventions as far as the sovereign wealth funds are concerned. I would like just to provide you with a comment and a question. When it comes to the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, I think the Gulf countries followed a quantum leap kind of stride in order to establish these funds to resemble a cushion against any crisis, especially the financial crisis of 2008 and the plummeting prices of oil that started 5 years ago. But still, we do face challenges in the Gulf countries. Most importantly, as Dr. Hend has said, is the issue of sustainability, how such funds can be sustainable. This is the first and foremost challenge. I think securing such funds ought to hinge on diversification efforts, and the diversification efforts must rely on the diversification of the economies. Without achieving diversification of the economies, one cannot talk about the sustainability of such sovereign funds. The second challenge that we encounter in this regard is to do with the levels of governance. How could we better the level of governance of such funds, especially as far as exposure, accountability, and transparency is concerned? So my question is, what are the practical solutions that can be applied in order to better the levels of transparency, accountability, and exposure? This is my question. Thank you. Thank you very much, our guest from Algeria. Please allow me, there are two other questions, and then you can answer. A question from Jacqueline. Jacqueline wonders, do we think that the investments, and Ibrahim, you can correct my translation of this question. Let me do it in English then.
What about the issue of food security؟ وأيضا تتساءل نفسها عن استثمارات الدول الخليجية كصناديق استثمارية في Sub-Saharan African من باب التنوع الجيوبوليتيكلي. وهناك سؤال أيضا من قبل.
There's also another question from Murad. I think this question is addressed to Dr. Nayef. One of the panelists talked about transparency and governance and the importance of the sustaining such sovereign wealth funds, especially when Dr. Abdurrahman compared this with Chile, Norway, and other countries. To what extent the lack of governance and the lack of transparency can lead to perhaps
to what extent it influences development of investment and foreign assets value. فنترك المجال لمن يرغب. سارة موجودة معنا أو
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Maybe you can, Sara, take few
So
minutes to answer.
shall I take? Yes, let me take.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. Let me take
Yes.
Jacqueline's questions.
It's okay. Yes, please go ahead, Sara.
Questions across the GCC because of understandable reasons, because of the climate, because of the lack of ability to develop the agriculture sector due to shortage of water, etc. It has been one of the important aspects of the government investment plans by the GCC to acquire agricultural land in Southeast Asia, in Africa. There are even specific in Qatar, for example, there is a specific government investment organization that looks at investments in food sector and so forth. Of course, these are not going to be changed. They are going to remain in place, and perhaps in the long term, with rise of population and rise of food demand, and at the same time the decline of supply of global food production, it is going to remain an important and a strategic aspect of the government planning across the GCC, whether specifically through these investment vehicles that we call them sovereign wealth funds today, or through separate investment organizations. Because when we talk about sovereign wealth funds, up until recently, of course, as a result of these changes in the global dynamic, global economic dynamics, and the introduction of the government visions and so on, we are witnessing as some changes into the traditional sense of defining what sovereign wealth fund meant. Sovereign wealth funds across the GCC were traditionally long-term investors that mainly looked at stabilization at the time of fluctuation of oil prices and intergenerational saving funds. And now, post 2014, 2013, we are seeing more obvious focus of these investment vehicles towards diversification of the local economies. So the trend that hasn't been changed is the concern over food security, whereas the intergenerational aspect and the stabilizational aspect are now being ever so slightly redefined and reshuffled to include new strategies and new concerns for the GCC economies. In terms of Sub-Saharan Africa investments, what I can for sure say, I haven't looked at it specifically region by region for Sub-Saharan to look at Sub-Saharan Africa in a specific in the specific context of GCC recent investments through sovereign wealth funds. But what I can
سارة اختفى صوتك يا سارة. طيب هل ممكن نكسب
Sara,
الوقت؟
we lost you. Dr. Nayef, perhaps, or Dr. Khalid can intervene now before Sara comes again. Dr. Nayef or Dr. Khalid, anyone of you? Dr. Khalid is speaking, but his microphone is still muted. Yes, I can quickly focus on the diversification of the economy in accordance with what Dr. Boufleh had said, especially in the Gulf context, and having revenues that pour into the sovereign wealth funds. As far as the diversification of the economy in the Gulf is concerned, it is very costly because it is labor intensive. We have strategic industries that relate to certain products, and these are lacking, especially as far as the automobile industries and other big industries as such. I think the diversification must be knowledge driven, especially in the IT sector. We can produce services related products. We can also produce certain kind of products in the logistic domain, in the IT domain, in the services provision domain, and so on and so forth. But as far as the multinational companies are concerned, we cannot compete with them. And most of the previous attempts were futile. Dr. Hend is saying you have been a pessimist. QIA, the Qatar Investment Authority in Qatar, was successful on the food security front. There is a company called Hasad or Harvest, and it was successful to invest in the farming industries in Qatar. They also have their own kind of plans for food production. So these sovereign wealth funds, if they deal with such levels of food security, then I think they'll be successful. Apart from that, I think competing will be difficult, and I've mentioned this in my study. If I have into place a plant that would potentially compete a plant in China, I think I will be punching far above my weight. I think we need to think differently, and we need to be humble, modest, and I think that the revenues from the sovereign wealth funds can be utilized in different assets in a selective kind of fashion, and we need to focus on the local economy indeed. And then we can invest abroad definitely in certain kind of industries. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Sara, are you back?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry, my internet was a bit funny. I'm sorry.
Comment, please.
Yes, I just wanted to finish what I was saying. I don't know how far did you hear me, but my point about my 2 cents about the question on Sub-Saharan Africa was that these investment vehicles have proven to have interest across sectors, across geographic zones, and that has changed depending on the global economic dynamics. Emerging markets at certain period in time offered a higher investment return, and of course, understandably, a lot of these sovereign wealth funds have shifted their investments towards these markets. Sub-Saharan Africa, I do not have off the top of my head a specific investment case to mentioned, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. And of course, the question of diversification remains the biggest challenge that the GCC are facing. And this is something that all the colleagues have already mentioned. And the role of these sovereign wealth funds in this diversification process can be crucial. So if the decisions and the investments are made wisely, and at the same time they are accompanied by the measures that are required for reform of the public sector and the labor sector in the domestic economies, of course they can be a huge contributing factor. But I can hear that Dr. Khalid was a little bit pessimistic about the role that they are able to play in this. But I think they are part and parcel and complementing each other, the investments by sovereign wealth funds and the local reforms that are crucial and important.
Yeah, thank you, Sara. Dr. Nayef.
أنا شوية باخذ من كلام الدكتور خالد وبرد على الدكتور.
Yes, following what Dr. Khalid has said, and I will answer Dr. Nabil Boufleh as well. disagree with Dr. Khalid as far as the diversification of the economies is concerned. Have we been uh, serious in this regard? I think we have not. I think the lack of seriousness on the part of the politicians was the main reason for this failure. As far as the investments are concerned, yes, we had certain attempts on the diversification front, but there are certain conflict of interests as far as politics is concerned.
خلينا نقول الاستفاده منها في حال تم عمليه الاصلاح الاقتصادي. الان بالنسبه حق الدكتور
As far as Dr. Nabil Boufleh is concerned, what are the practical solutions in place?
ما يميز الصناديق السياديه خاصه
The
التعاون ان
sovereign wealth funds
عندنا في الكويت
rely on very stringent kind of legislations. In Kuwait, these laws are very solid and stringent, and we cannot change even one line or section or article. So we need to reform the legal framework in our countries in order to achieve our goals.
حضور الكريم
Ladies
الأساتذة
and gentlemen,
الرئيسيين حقيقة
dear
جزيل
panelists,
الاستمتاع جدا
I personally enjoyed
الجلسة ومداخلاتكم
the
القيمة
interventions
كان الوقت
and
محدود لأن أنا عندي
I
أسئلة
wished I
كثير
had
كثير
more
حابة
time because I'm passionate about this subject and I wanted to ask a number of questions in light of what takes place on the political front, the normalization efforts, and the what is simmering beneath the surface between Iran and Israel, and so on and so forth. But still, I would like to thank you all, and the time is tight. We have 15 minutes break in order to resume the second session. Thank you all, and have a good day.